Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the New Deal and Depression era. And in the previous lecture, we began talking about some of the so-called voices of protest who opposed FDR from either side of the political spectrum. In this lecture, we're going to continue that discussion, identifying a few more of these voices of protest and discussing the influence they have on FDR and the continued programs of the New Deal. As mentioned in the previous lecture, FDR had his critics from the right in the political spectrum, but he tended to be more worried about critics coming from the left, members of his own party or even to the left of his own party. Perhaps the most prominent of these critics was Huey Long, one of the most famous and prominent political officials in the history of Louisiana. He had been governor of Louisiana, and at the time we are studying, he was a senator in the 1930s from Louisiana. During his time in leadership, he had helped to fund and build hundreds of schools, hospitals, bridges, roads, and so on in the state of Louisiana. If we think of the New Deal as engaging in these kind of public works programs, Louisiana was doing it on a much bigger scale. Huey Long decided to make a run for the presidency in 1936. So obviously that posed some kind of threat to FDR. His platform was called Share Our Wealth. And if you just think about that phrase, it's a broad plan to redistribute the wealth from the wealthy to the needy. It called for free education, for cheap food for those in need, for minimum salaries. And when we think about, there was no minimum wage at that time. Minimum wage in part comes about as a result of the pull of Huey Long and others who were calling for it. So none of these things are necessarily all that controversial. It called for old age pensions, which did not exist at that time, but again, we will see them coming during the New Deal, and payment to war veterans. All of those are sort of reasonable programs, although some were opposed to these kind of public welfare programs. But where the Share Our Wealth plan became really controversial was that it also called for maximum salaries. And so, according to his platform and the plan he put together, one could earn up to $10,000 a year, and anything over and above that would have been taxed and gone to the general fund to be redistributed to the masses to bring everyone up to a minimum income of $2,000 a year. So according to Huey Long's plan, all Americans would be somewhere in that range of $2,000 a year to $10,000. Well, as you can imagine, anyone earning more than $10,000 would have found something objectionable in this plan. And it's fair to say that the wealthier one was, the more profoundly opposed to Huey Long you would have been. Because if you were earning $100,000 a year or $1 million a year, everything over $10,000 would have gone to tax. In short, Huey Long, while he was wildly popular with the masses in Louisiana, had a line of opponents who were very wealthy and very powerful. And so in some ways, the most empowered in Louisiana were among the opponents of Huey Long. Huey Long was assassinated in 1935, even as his National Share Our Wealth Society had 7.5 million members, and he was beginning to look like a serious threat, even to FDR, for the presidency in 1936. But he was shot on the steps of the new state capitol building that Long himself had helped to fund in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in September 1935. He was shot by a man named Dr. Carl Weiss, whose family were longtime opponents of Huey Long. And there is some mystery associated with Huey Long's death and conspiracy theories, because Long wasn't driven straight to the hospital after he was shot by Weiss. He was driven around for a while before he arrived at the hospital. And the best surgeons at that time were not available to help Huey Long, and so he was operated on by some surgeons that some scholars have said were inferior. Of course, it's unclear as to what all of that means, but it's certainly obvious that Huey Long had many wealthy, powerful, and prominent opponents who seem to have figured, at least, in Huey Long's death. Another prominent voice of protest during this era came from Father Charles Coughlin. Coughlin was a Catholic priest from Detroit who had a huge following for his weekly radio program called The Golden Hour of the Little Flower, a program that reached up to 45 million listeners around the country. Now, Coughlin's political views were vague. At times, he attacked capitalists, he attacked socialists and communists, he championed democracy, but criticized those who didn't vote as he suggested. And among his most vicious attacks were those against Wall Street elites and bankers. But in Coughlin's view, FDR and the New Deal was moving too slowly. He considered and called FDR a tool of big business and the bankers. Even worse, Coughlin was an avowed anti-Semite, and this is in the era when Adolf Hitler was on the rise. He denounced Jews, communists, and bankers, and by the late 1930s, he voiced his support for Hitler and Mussolini. His sermons became more and more erratic, and he actually was becoming something of a lunatic. Eventually, in 1940, the higher clergy forced him to shut down his radio program. And I use the picture there on the top right intentionally because I think it does bear some resemblance to Adolf Hitler. It might have to do with the way the shadow is falling across his nose. It looks a little bit like Hitler's mustache. But you get a sense of the same kind of demagoguery from Charles Coughlin. And a final example of these voices of protest from the left was a doctor named Francis Townsend from Long Beach, California, who himself was up in years, and he was concerned overall with the plight of the elderly. Before the 1920s, the care of the elderly was natural on farms and so on. But it didn't come so naturally now in the age of cities and the urban environment, when families tended to split up as the generations went by. Sinclair called for the government to guarantee $200 a month to the elderly, and called for a national sales tax to pay for it. Now, Townsend was wildly popular amongst the elderly. You get a sense of that from the picture and descriptions here of the elderly kind of cheering wildly at his proposals and coming out in these huge gatherings. But there's certainly one thing to note about Townsend and his followers and this cause, and that is that the elderly are amongst the most reliable voters in the country. And so if millions of the elderly are supporting a cause, that is certainly worthy of attracting the attention of prominent politicians like FDR. So we're going to talk about some of this in the lectures to come, and how many of these causes and policies and programs proposed by these so-called voices of protest are actually going to be adopted in some cases by FDR and implemented in what we know as the Second New Deal. Now I want to take just a moment here to make the observation that FDR, throughout the years of the New Deal and the programs that he's implementing, had a huge majority in both houses of Congress. And so if we look first on this chart, or on this slide, President Hoover from 1931 to 33, the last 2 years of his presidency, he was Republican, of course. He had a slight majority in the Senate, a majority of 1, and the Democrats had a slight majority in the House. Thus, Congress was divided, and as any of us can understand, it made it pretty difficult to get things done. When the two houses, in particular in Congress, are split, it's difficult to get legislation through. But now if we look at FDR and the balance in Congress during his first term, after that sweeping Democratic victory in the 1932 elections, he had a huge majority in the Senate of 60 to 35. and a huge majority in the House of 310 to 117. Then we have the election in 1934, which was essentially a referendum on the New Deal and on FDR. FDR himself was not up for re-election in 1934, of course, but it was a midterm election. And as you can see, the majorities for the Democrats even grow. 69 to 25 in the Senate, 319 to 103 in the House. So this is what he's looking at after the elections of 1934. Huge majorities in both houses of Congress. And this drives him ahead into what we will call the Second New Deal, which I'll discuss in future lectures. But note that even after the election of 1936, when FDR himself is up for re-election and wins a landslide victory that I'll discuss in a future lecture, his majorities in Congress grow even more, 76 to 16 in the Senate and 331 to 89 in the House. There was some talk at that time that the Republicans didn't even need to keep showing up and that the whole party should shut down and be recreated as something else because they were so ineffective at that time. So imagine the power that the president has when he has that kind of majority in both houses of Congress, just an ironclad majority. This is certainly veto-proof and can more or less do whatever they wanted to get through Congress. And so again, that harkens back to some of the complaints from the right that FDR was becoming too powerful. But that's a topic for future lectures. We will discuss some of that moving forward, but in the next lecture, we'll start to talk about the acts of the Second New Deal.